All right, it is 8:05, so I'm going to get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 44 of the Rankin Technical College Online AWD1000 Web Development Technologies class for fall 2023. As mentioned in the email I sent out earlier this morning, today we're going to go over the Muroc text chapters 6 and 7. Next week sometime, probably Wednesday, but I'm not sure, you will have hot number 3, which will be a test on chapters 6 and 7. That will be the last hands-on test you will have this semester. All right. I did attach a zip file this morning, and in just a minute, I'm going to go over the contents of that file. Okay. On Monday, we'll go over both the short exercises and the extra exercises for chapters 6 and 7. Not sure exactly what we'll do on Tuesday, and like I said, probably on Wednesday we'll have our next hands-on test. So if you have not yet turned in the hands-on test number 2 on chapters 4 and 5, and some people have and some people have not, it's due by midnight tonight. Your chapters 4 and 5 written test, labs, and homework, and I should just remove that. There aren't any labs. So really written test and homework. They were due last Wednesday. And finally, your chapter 6 and 7, again, written tests and homework will be due a week from Sunday. All right. So with that, before we get started, let me just quickly show you, if you haven't opened it yet, the contents of what I sent out to you this morning. All right. So it's in a folder called DOM, Document Object Model. And there's about 4 or 5 articles in there. There's a PDF in there. And there's even an entire website that I created a couple years ago, but I updated by putting 2023 on the date, but that website is not responsive. All right. So to start with, I just wanted to mention this, and that is the best place to learn how to use the DOM. This is one of the best things that W3 Schools has done. I went back over it again. It's just really, really, really well done. You can go over it. I mean, if you really want to learn this stuff, you can probably go over it in about an hour. All right. But you've got that. These 2 crash courses by Brad Traversy, I watched the first one again yesterday. These are both about 6 years old, but the thing is the intricacies of working with the document object model have not changed. All right. So again, done pretty well. And then there's a bunch of, and I'm not going to go over really any of them, how to manipulate the DOM, the ultimate beginner's guide. And it is about a 20-page article, but they've got plenty of examples in there. This is taken from the developer.mozilla.org site, Introduction to the DOM. And again, there's a few examples in there, but I think it's more theoretical in nature. A beginner's guide to DOM from this atatis.com. Again, pretty good read. It's like 14 pages. The DOM explained for beginners. Again, how it works, about 8 or 9 pages, free code camp article. And then finally, the last one, become a better JavaScript developer. Now, this is pretty recent, as you can see, October 23rd, but they talk about how you get better at JavaScript. Well, this is what this class is about. Learn the fundamentals. All right. We've done some of the ES6 features and functionality in here. We've talked about arrow functions. I have shown you template literals. You may not remember them, but we'll go over them again. We will talk about classes before the semester ends, but the destructuring and promises, we'll talk about promises by the end of the year. The destructuring is more in the next class, in the AWD1111 class. All right, same with asynchronous programming. All right, same with working with libraries. All right, version control, you've been using Git all semester, but notice number 7, explore the document object model. That's what today is about. All right. You can read the rest of the stuff that's in here yourselves. All right. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention for now about that, is I found this thing. It was free. It's a 126-page thing on understanding the document object model. Now, of course, you're not expected to read this, but it's just another thing in there if you're interested. And you'll notice it really starts here, introduction to the DOM, but there were a plenty of examples in here as well. And again, they started with something very fundamental. All right. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. We will look at the website that I gave you when we're done with this. And again, come next week, we will be doing this, develop a temperature converter. And notice it works with the radio buttons. And then we'll do 6.2, which dynamically builds an array. So it lets you add students and grades to an array. And then we'll go in and modify what you're going to see in here in this example, or in this chapter rather, which is modifying a frequently asked questions application. And then there's a couple for chapter 7, developing a clock, and then putting a stopwatch with that clock. All right, so that's what we will go over on Monday of next week. And the other thing that then we'll go over on Monday of next week, from the short exercises, upgrading the miles per gallon application. And you can see over here, this is the kind of thing we're going to be doing, working with the document object model. All right. And again, displaying a test score app. And then this is chapter 7 stuff. So notice preloading images and using a timer. And the last for that. All right. So we'll look at a bunch of that stuff. Some of it we'll start looking at today. All right. So with that said, I want to jump into the book. And as we do, that'll put us, once we finish this, we'll be done with section 1. All right. So once we finish 6 and 7, we're done with section 1, JavaScript Essentials. I've already told you the plan is next Monday, we're going to go over all of the short exercises and all of the extra exercises. All right, we'll take our time, so hopefully you'll have a good understanding of that. Okay, if we don't finish it on Monday, we'll bleed into Tuesday then. Tuesday, I'll probably give you some kind of a pre-test. We're kind of building on what we've been working on so far. I might go and add some DOM manipulation to both the guessing game and the BMI program, okay? Then probably starting next Thursday, we'll go over chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now, probably on there, the way that we'll do this is I'll lecture on 8 and 9, and we'll look at an example or two. All right, you won't be responsible for anything in 8 and 9. I've said this before. There'll be no homework, there'll be no labs, there'll be no written tests. All right, and I've talked with Evan and Doug, my counterparts in at the St. Louis campus. They don't go through 8, 9, 10, and 11. I think it's worth going through just because of the fact that many thousands of websites still use jQuery. So Thursday, you can look at us doing 8 and 9. Then the following Monday, probably 10 and 11. Then after that, we're going to build a website together as a class. You will not have to turn this website in. I'm saying this again, you will not have to turn this website in. That said, you might want to code along with me. All right. And we'll talk about why that's the case next week. All right. Then we're going to jump right into 12 through 16. I'm not going to read any of those. You can see them right there. And we're going to do the same kind of thing. You may get some homework assigned for 12 through 16. I don't know yet. I want to go back and reread those chapters again. If you do, there will not be a hands-on test. The only thing that you would get would be written tests for 12 through 16. The rest of the stuff we're going to do together. After we get done with that, and I believe I mentioned this to you already, that like 3 weeks from Monday, believe it or not already, is Thanksgiving week. I will be off that entire week. So there's a very good chance that by the time we get to that point, we will have gotten all the way through chapter 16 here. All right. And I'm going to give you some kind of a last assignment. You'll get a whole week to work on it. All right. But some kind of a last assignment where you will create one last website, which will incorporate a lot of this stuff. Then when you get back from the Thanksgiving break, we've got, I believe it's 4 weeks minus a day. All right. Because we end on a Thursday. We'll spend 2 of those weeks going over React, and don't worry about that right now. And if necessary, 3 weeks. Then the last week of class, I will probably on that Monday lecture on these 3 chapters. No homework, no written tests, no hands-on tests, no labs, no nothing. But just to give people an introduction, especially those going into the AWD1111 class in spring. For the rest of you who will not be going into there, I will spend part of a period, probably 1 hour, going over what you will be going through and covering, etc. If the next class you take is the AWD1100 C# programming class in spring. So that's what we've got to look forward to, or however you want to put it, for the rest of the semester. All right, so I'm going to jump with that right into chapter 6. And I will tell you, maybe it's just me and age kept catching up with me or whatever. As you go through this, please, please don't worry about memorizing anything. One of the reasons that I mentioned to you that you might want to go over the W3 schools JavaScript, going over the DOM operations, is it's got a it's very comprehensive as far as the different kinds of things that you can do. I'm constantly going out there when I forget how to do something. All right. So as you can see, the chapter is about 30 pages, and we'll start with DOM scripting properties and methods. Then there'll be an application, FAQ type of an application. I've got all those applications up right now, and they're up, and I've got them loaded under Visual Studio Code. So we'll look at them when we get to that point. And we'll talk about, as it says there, how to script forms and controls. Now you might think, well, I already know forms and I already know controls. But one of the things they're going to talk about in there is how you can do more validation, client-side validation, using JavaScript. And that's the how to script forms and controls and the register application. All right. Finally, the last 7 or 8 pages are really how you can modify the DOM. What the heck even is that? What they're saying is that what you can do when you use the document object model is you can add things dynamically to a web page, update things dynamically that exist already on a web page, and delete things dynamically that exist on a web page. All right. And that's where some of the real power of using the document object model really comes in. So that's what we've got to look forward to for the rest of the chapter here. All right. So they mention here, it says, before you learn the properties and methods of the DOM core spec, you can go out to the W3C and you can type in DOM core specification, and you can read all about this if you have an interest. All right. Now, notice what it says here. When you create an HTML page and you load it into the browser, all right, the associated document object model is built for you. You don't see it per se, like you see HTML, like you see CSS, like you see JavaScript, but it's there. And you can program virtually anything on a web page. As they mentioned there, this DOM contains nodes that represent each element on a page. Many of these elements, not every one, but many of these elements also have attributes. For instance, let's say that I create an H2 element, all right, and I decide that I'm going to go And I'm going to add some text like you typically would do for H2. You can dynamically change that text that's in there. All right. You can remove that text that's in there, etc. All right. Now, as we go through this, and you're going to see the picture on the next page, you're going to see a picture of element nodes. And there's different types of nodes in here. Element nodes are going to be things like an HTML element, a body element, etc. And then there's text nodes. And typically that's the text that goes under one of these element nodes. All right. Again, sometimes there's also attribute nodes. All right. And these are all things that you can program. And what I mean is they're all things that you can change things, add things, or remove things from. So you can manipulate all of this stuff programmatically. All right. Now they go through a bunch of stuff in here that may or may not make sense to you, but the HTML that we put in there, that HTML tag, is basically what's known as the root node. It's the only part of the DOM that doesn't have any parent. All right. Now they're not going to show it exactly like that, but it's pretty much is the way it is. They'll probably say the document is at the top. That's fine. All right. Now it says the DOM, the document object model, it says it's filled with properties and methods. Now we've talked a little bit about properties and methods already. For instance, properties of me, myself, Jeff Scott, my properties would include things like my height, my weight, my eye color, my hair color, etc. All right. Methods. So my methods are things like eat, what do I eat? Drink, what do I drink? Sleep, how long do I sleep, etc. All right. And as it says, the properties and methods for working with DOM nodes are defined by a spec called the interface. And we're going to look at that as we go on. And finally, they mention here, as you go through this, you're going to come across terms like parent, child, sibling, descendant, and they even mention these are going to be similar to the types of relationships that you'd see, in human beings. So they've got the code for a web page here. There's nothing at all special about this. So you'll notice that we've got our doc type. All right, then we've got HTML. There's our beginning HTML, there's our ending HTML. Well, there's our beginning HTML right here. The HTML has two direct descendants. It has two children. It's got a child called head, and it's got a child called body. You can see those right here. So these two things are direct descendants of HTML. And HTML here is known as a root node because it is the only thing that you can see on here that doesn't have a parent. All right, it's at the top, whatever you want to call it. Everything that cascades down from here is a descendant. Now, usually, you might say that, for example, these are the children. These two are the children of head. These two are the children of body. There's the child of H1. For form, there's its three children. For label, that's its child. For span, that's its child. All right. The reason I'm telling you that is you don't typically say, well, does that mean the text is a great, grandchild, etc.? That's not typically how you would refer to it. All right. But you talk about direct descendants usually. So HTML has two direct descendants. All right. Head has one direct descendant. Body has two direct descendants. Form has three direct descendants, etc. And you'll notice with some of these, 4 of these 5 things that are in here end with text. All right. These are known as what are called leaf nodes. And what that means is they don't have any children. So this is a leaf node. 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 This. All right. Because it doesn't have any descendants. All right. So you create this. and this gets created for you. The reason that that's important is, as you'll learn as we go on in the chapter here, is there are many different methods that you can use to manipulate virtually anything that's in here. All right. Now they mentioned here on the bottom, they say here are the nodes. All right. So notice document, it says, is the root node of the DOM. It can have only one element node as a child node. Well, that's pretty much, again, what we have here with HTML. All right. Everything that you see here in blue, those are HTML elements. Everything that's in there is an HTML element. Some of these things have attributes. Some of these things don't have attributes. You can manipulate attributes of any element using the DOM as well. All right. And they show in here text. These are also, all right, these are also typically referred to as, that would be, for example, this is a text attribute of the title element kind of thing. There's even other things that are in here that are not mentioned in here. If you got a comment that you put on an HTML page, it really goes in kind of like, rather than being text, it's a comment. All right. And they mentioned some of that stuff here. I don't want to sit and read to you. Notice, though, it is a hierarchical collection. Kind of like when you look at this, you can look at it as like a family tree, or you can look at it as even like, you know, if you've ever worked for a company that's got a president and then a couple vice presidents, etc., that kind of thing. But it is a hierarchical arrangement. It is created for you automatically. As they say in that third bullet, you can use JavaScript to modify the web page by manipulating the DOM. Not only that, almost always, when you go and you manipulate the DOM like that using JavaScript, it's not like that. You don't get an instantaneous where you see the change. You might have to refresh the page or whatever. The problem with a DOM, actually, believe it or not, I just mentioned it to you, is if you do a lot of manipulation on a web page using the DOM, I mean a lot, it can really slow it down. So if you're doing all sorts of things programmatically with the DOM and you're constantly updating the web page like that, you can find that sometimes it's not that your web page will go to a crawl, that it won't be doing anything, but it might take a few seconds or more after you do something until you actually see that change. Now, one of the things that we're going to be talking about in a later class, React. And the reason that we go over React now is React fixes some of the problems. It fixes some of the problems that you see with this. And what I mean by that is React uses what's called a virtual DOM. All right. It's like, what the heck is that? You don't have to worry about it now. But rather than manipulating the DOM directly, it manipulates, it's kind of like working with a copy, but it manipulates it faster. All right. As it says again, to modify the DOM, you use the properties and methods defined in the DOM core spec. So basically, all that stuff that you saw in there, those were all nodes. Nodes. All right. And there's a lot of properties that you can use to work with these nodes. Some of these you might not agree, but I don't even know if they'll show it in here, but we've actually looked at one or two of these already, not the ones in here. All right, but we've looked at a couple of the methods in here. And what I mean is we've looked at document.getElementById and document.querySelector. Those are actually two different document object model methods that you can use to manipulate the properties of the node interface. So when you look at what's in here, I don't want to read to you. All right, but you can do this. So notice what they talk about parent and child nodes. You can use JavaScript to find, for example, if you are in child node, who that child's parent is. If you are in a parent node, to find out who the direct descendants are. All right. And notice when you work with children or child nodes, there's a first child, there's the last child. There's even ways to work with a lot of these where it doesn't matter if, let's say you've got 5 children. It's like, okay, I could work with child 1 or with child 2, and that's true. But you can use this next element sibling where you can basically work with any. So if you had 5 children, direct descendants, you could work with any of those. All right. If you want to find out what a node contains, you can use the node value. All right. And if you want the text that's in there, you can use text content. Good news, bad news type of situation is almost always when you're trying to do something like this and utilize the DOM, there's more than one way of doing it. All right. And they'll give you some examples of that. And again, I know I've already mentioned this, but I'm just going to put this in here. So I just typed in W3 schools DOM reference. All right, and it's going to bring it up right here. The whole thing, there's 14 sections. They're right here. And there's examples of every single thing that's in here. They ask you to run through examples. There's even a couple quizzes in there, and they ask you to do something. And if you get confused, there's even a button there and you just click the button and it shows you the answer. But like I said, if you want to learn how to do this stuff, this is, with all the stuff I've given you today, if you went through these 14 sections and had a basic understanding, you'd be better off than reading any of those articles that I've provided for you. That's how important I think this is. Now, some of the stuff that's in here is what we're talking about now. All right, the DOM itself, working with elements, and then they get into working with HTML, working with forms, and the DOM, working with CSS. Then they do simple animations, make things move around on the screen. One of the things we're going to be heavily into in here will be these two, DOM events and the DOM event listener. And you're going to see ways that you can go in and using the DOM, do some of the event listener stuff that we've been working with. All right. So I would strongly suggest that you take a look in here and see if you understand or don't understand this stuff. Let's take a look at an example or two. So we've got this. And remember, the only difference in this example that you see right here, the only difference between a span is when you've got a div, it takes up 100% of the screen length. And since a div is not an inline element, all right, it's got basically a line before it, a blank line before it, and a blank line after it. A span is an inline element, so it only takes up the space on the screen that it requires, and it doesn't give you a new line. So we've got here welcome that looks like it's inside of a bold tag, all right? And then the word back, and back is underlined, all right? And then there's an exclamation point, which is in an italics tag. Why did they do it like that? I didn't write the book, so I can't tell you. All right. But what they're saying here is if I want to be able to grab everything that's in there, I can do a query selector. This is what we did, the examples that I gave you the other day. And we're grabbing span. Notice when you use this, you don't need the pound sign there. All right. So we're putting this into a variable. This would be referred to as a getter, Getter. We are getting the value of something because it's on the right-hand side of an equal sign, and we're copying it to a variable on the left-hand side of an equal sign. All right? So we're associating this with this. And if we do change the value, that's in here, all right, if we do change the value that's in there, it'll be reflected in here. All right. And again, they go through this. I don't want to run through the first child, the last child. Again, take a look at it. I don't want to confuse you. All right. When you work with text, there's more than one way that you can manipulate text. In fact, there's a lot of ways. They'll talk about text content in here. All right. They'll talk about, for example, inner HTML, which we have actually looked at, but I've never really talked much about it before. And we'll see that in just a bit. All right. Notice in this example here, now what we're doing, all right, now what we're doing is we're coming in here and we've got this, what we had before on the right-hand side, I said it was a getter. Now it's on the left-hand side and it's called a setter. S-E-T-T-E-R. And notice we've got first child. All right. Well, the first child that's in here, that was in there, was actually this right in here, rather than welcome back. That's the first child. The word welcome is the first child. But they've come in now and programmatically changed it to hurry. So instead of welcome back, it says hurry back. Now you might look at that and say, it's a big deal. But what's important here is if you've got a lot of things on a web page and one or more of those things on the web page, I'm not talking about like the date and the time, all right, but I'm talking about something you're going to allow a user to manipulate. All right, you can use the DOM so they've always got the most up-to-date stuff that they've asked for. All right. All right, so they showed you some of the properties. Here are some of the methods. And again, we've looked at some of these. There is a query selector, and notice there's a query selector all. The difference between those is a query selector. So if I had a query selector and I put in there P, in where it says selector right there, if I put in there double quote P, double quote, it would find the first paragraph on a page. If I used a query selector all right, and I put P in double quotes where they show it right here, it would find all paragraphs on the page. And it returns them, in basically what's called a collection. And a collection is like an array. But you can't use typical array methods on a collection, but it is like one. All right. In fact, if you go through the Brad Traversy thing, it's 2 parts. The whole thing is an hour long. He goes through a really big thing where he goes through and he shows how you can sit there and use query selector and query selector all, etc. All right. Here's some more methods. Notice that every one of those things that's in there is an attribute. Why is that important? Okay. Why is that important? Because an attribute is something that you provide to an element. So for instance, right here, if you look where I am, I'm under an HTML UL element. And right here, we've got 2 different attributes. One is images/lion.ping. One of them is images/tiger.ping. So think about this. All right, this is an example, and I'm not even going to say it's a good example. But let's suppose that you had what you called a zoo page. All right, so you had a page of different animals at the zoo, and you asked a user, name your favorite 2 animals in the zoo. Maybe you had a drop-down list. I don't know, maybe it was something else. So they picked 2 of them out. You could then come in here and programmatically, by using basically the set attribute, you might have to remove what's there first, and then a set attribute, you'd be able to, so if they instead of lions and tigers, let's say they chose penguins and I don't know, sea lions. You could change that from lion, penguin, and from tiger to sea lion. And again, that's maybe not the best example, but you can ask the user anything on a web page and dynamically change it based on their response. Now, do you use this a lot? That isn't the point. The point of this chapter is this stuff is there if you would like to use it. That's what's important about it. All right. So again, they say here how to get an array of all the LI elements. That is not actually correct. It's not a real array. It's basically, it's a collection of elements. And as I mentioned before, if you want to be able to use that collection of elements like it was a real array, you have to convert it into an array. And there's ways of doing that. We're not going to get into that right now. Notice next how to test for. So this is saying, is there an element here? And then if you find there is, then you can use it. Setting an element. Notice when they're setting it here, there's no equal sign. As I mentioned before, there's typically more than one way of doing the same thing. So this is one way of setting something. This is one way of removing something. There are other ways of doing it as well. All right. And some people say, it's a great thing that we've got all these different ways of doing things. And other people say, why isn't there just one way? All right. The main reason there isn't just one way is no one can agree really on which is the best way to do things. So over time, more and more ways of doing something have been added. All right. And just because there's 5 different ways of doing something, when you learn it, do you want to use all 5? I'd say, you know what? Yes. Until, so if you're trying to do something, use all 5. And if one of them makes sense more than the others, then just use that one from then on. All right. That's what you should be striving for right now, is not to see if there's 5 ways of doing this. You're not going to impress a potential employer with, I know all 5. But if you can use a way that's most intuitive to you, all right, and you can use that well, that would be impressive. All right. And if that employer came back, so why'd you do it this way? Because I found that way to be the most understandable and the most intuitive. Be kind of hard for somebody to argue with rationale like that. All right. Here they've got that dollar sign, and we've used that before. Okay. And when you do that, I got an example here. There it is. Nope. Well, they've got the dollar sign here. They're using it in a different way. But basically, again, you're using it as an alias. All right. There's the URL at the top of the page for the actual DOM specification. And what that means is if you do go out there, notice that's the W3's own documentation. You can find virtually everything there is regarding the document object model. All right. I will tell you, and I'm not trying to be funny here, that is probably some of the driest reading that you'll ever come across. All right. It's very technical in nature. All right. And it's written that way. All right. Some of the properties that are available in there are shown right here. So notice that you can manipulate things like links, images. All right. And they again will show you some examples right here. Okay. So again, notice they're doing a get and they're doing some gets and some sets in here. And as I mentioned, when they do the get, notice again, it's on the right-hand side of an equal sign because get means you're not changing it. A get is read only. All right. And a set really is write only. So you'll notice here it's on the right-hand side of an equal sign, so you're not changing it. Here you're on the left-hand side of an equal sign, so you are changing it. And as they mentioned here on the bottom of the page, the HTML spec provides shortcuts to make it easier to work with this. All right. And, again, as it says there, makes it easier to work with DOM nodes. And I've mentioned this before in other lectures, and that is to use the word easier is relative. In other words, while you're learning this stuff, none of it may seem easy. All right. But again, we will look at some applications where hopefully when you see it in action, it's not so much that it's easy, but it'll become more and more understandable to you. All right. The class list property of the element interface says previously you learned two ways you can work with the class attribute. All right, first, there's a set attribute and there's a remove attribute, but there's other ways that you can work with the stuff in here as well. All right, let's just take a look at the examples because again, I don't believe at least it's worth going over this and sitting there and reading to you, but we'll look at a couple of examples. All right, so notice here they've got something that's list. It says it contains the class names in the class attribute and provides properties and methods for working with them. Things like length, value, contains, add, remove, etc. So you come in here and you're looking at this and you're like, okay, then tell me, okay, this is fine. All right, let's just say I even get this. What is this buying me right here? Well, notice, here's an example. They're assuming that you've got a class that's called blue. And what does that do? It might be something as simple as you've got a class called blue, all right? And, it might be, like I said, something as simple as color that you literally use. So you put in there for the class, color, colon, £, 00, what is it? 00FF. So it sets something blue. And notice that when you use this class list and you toggle, it's like a light switch. You turn it on if it's off, you turn it off if it's on. So one thing we could do here, they're assuming that you've got here, they're replacing, all right? They're replacing one color with another. Here they're removing a color. Here they're toggling a color. Why does that matter? Well, think about what you could do. All right. I mean, as an example, let's say that someone was filling out a form. All right. And you wanted to let them know as they move from field to field in the form, we're supposing they're going to fill it out in the order we gave it to them. So it's a typical 6 things or so. First name, last name, address, city, state, zip code, just something like that. All right. So you can assume that if they fill out something correctly, rather than blue like they show right here, we maybe would make that particular text box, we would put a green border around it, green meaning good. If they filled out something incorrectly, we might put a red border around it. All right. Meaning that there's a problem. Now, when you think about it, okay, when we talked a while back about Bootstrap, where we had a class called that you could use for text, for example, that was called success, and that was green. You had another one that was called danger, and you could use that was red. And that's the kind of thing they're talking about that you could potentially, these are ways that you can use that. All right, I mean, that's just something that popped into my head. There's plenty of other ways that you can do this. So the next thing we're going to see here is an FAQ application. It's a frequently asked questions app. I already have it up. All right, I have it up and we're going to look at it in just a minute. We'll look at the HTML, we'll look at the CSS, and we'll look at the JavaScript. And they even say right here, the way this is set up, all right, notice it's just got a title here, and then it's got a question. What is jQuery? And it's got, originally there was a plus sign there. If you click on the plus sign, it becomes a minus and you get the answer to your question. If you click on this plus sign, down in here would be the answer for why use jQuery. And if we clicked on this plus sign, would come down here and it would give you the answer, which is harder to learn, jQuery or JavaScript, which is an interesting question because jQuery is JavaScript. So in the HTML here, and again, we'll look at it in just a second, but they just show you how to build the form that's here. And you'll notice here that for the questions, they're H2s. So when you bring this up initially, this one right here, of course, the answer isn't showing. There's a plus sign here, and the text here is black. And that's the first H2. All right, what is jQuery? Then we've got another one, why use jQuery? Then one that says which is harder to use, or to learn rather, jQuery or JavaScript. Then underneath each one of those, for the first one, we've got just a paragraph that's in a div, and that's going to be hidden when we first start. Then under why use it, we've got another paragraph followed by an unordered list. For the last question, we've got another paragraph. All right, and you'll notice that we're using a JavaScript file called faqs.js. Now the CSS in here, there's nothing remarkable about it. You will notice that, for example, all the divs have a display none. All right, meaning those are all empty when we start. All right. And they even mention in here, the first statement in the handler for the DOM content loaded, we've worked a little bit with that, creates an array of the H2 elements. All right. Then there's a for loop. As it says, it's executed once for each one of the H2 elements. So what does that mean? That means that whatever one you click on, that's the one that you're going to be looping through. All right. And then finally, we look at, oh, I thought they were going to show it in here. They're not. So let's bring it up here. All right. Again, I've got it right here, and it's FAQs. All three of them that are in the chapter are right here. So if we look right here, here's the HTML. And like I said, there's nothing here. I'm going to run it. But I believe, at least, if I asked you to build this, I think you could all do it. Even if you don't think you could, I think you could. All right, and they've got this. It's running through a bunch of stuff, but here it is. All right, now maybe that one was blue at the get-go. I don't know. But notice if I click here, what happens? That became a plus sign. That became a minus, and it showed everything that was hidden. When I come down to here, well, notice right now the way this is set up. Okay. When you open one, you have to manually go in and close it. Is that a big thing? No. All right. But one of the things they ask you to do at the end of the chapter, I believe, is this, have only one open at a time. Here, we can have all three open. But I think that what they ask in the at the end of the chapter exercises is if you click this one, it'll look like this. If you click this one will automatically close first before that opens. All right. It's just a little bit nicer. It's kind of what most people would expect. And again, with the example they're giving, it's pretty simple, but we could put anything we wanted in there. Could be as big or as small as we wanted or needed it to be. All right. And then if we look at the CSS that's in here, like I said, the big thing is, all right, that with those divs, we're telling it initially to not display. All right. And also notice the plus and minus. Same kind of thing. You want to make sure that when you click a plus, it becomes a minus and vice versa. All right. Finally, if we look at the JavaScript that's in here, big enough, I guess. All right. But if we look at what's in here, let's close this and take a quick look at what's in here. Well, the first thing they're doing, they're use strict, so that's good. Then they're creating their alias. All right. Then it says here, declare a variable to hold a reference to a timer, make it global so that all functions can access it. Well, timers are going to be discussed in the next chapter, so don't really worry about that. But you should all know this by now, that because of the fact that both timer and counter were declared outside of any one of these routines, all right, since they were declared outside of any one of those routines, okay, that they're global. In other words, they don't have to be passed around. Right? Here was that terms thing that came up before. All right. And maybe you've seen that where you go into a website, even more than terms, rather than having to go with terms, you might have seen a thing where it comes up and it says, we use cookies on this site. And if you say that you accept that, basically, you're allowing them to write a cookie to your machine. I'm not saying it will happen, but it could happen. All right, so there's the go-to terms, there's the accept terms. And again, we're going to go over timers in the next chapter. So if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, but now they're saying whatever you have an ID of terms, set an attribute. All right, it'll have a class and that class will be hidden. All right, and then notice what we have here. This is the toggling that's taking place. All right, so notice we're toggling. So if it was a plus, it'll be a minus. If it was a minus, it'll be a plus. If it was open, it'll close. If it was closed, it'll open. And we're adding things in here, someplace in here, to a click event. We don't want anything special to happen when we do click on it. So we're calling the prevent default. We've talked about that one before. All right. And then what do we have down here? Well, we're putting in our event listener. And again, it's not like that should exactly be something new to people. All right. So we're saying as soon as all the document object model content has been loaded, basically call this. All right. And there's some set intervals in there. Notice it's commented out, but there's some set timeouts in there. And again, we'll go over all of this stuff in the next chapter. I didn't want to spend too much time on this one because most people look at it and find it really, really confusing. All right. But what we will do in just a few minutes after the break is we will go and we will look at the example for form validation, which should make a lot more sense to you. Now, notice what we're doing here. This is calling query selector all. So every H2, all right, that has an ID of facts, all right, or really every H2 under an ID of facts, we're going to now loop through it. And we're adding that click event listener to it, meaning again, it wouldn't matter if we had 10 of these. All right, we've only got 3 in the example, but even if we had 10, all right, it would set the click event to each one of them. So you could potentially add on to this program if you wanted to. Then notice they're setting the focus. Now, this is similar yet different, all right, to what we've done in the past. Why it's similar is when you set the focus, we're still using the focus method. So that's similar. What's different? Well, we're creating this list of H2 elements that's called H2 element. All right, so this is each one of these. So this is saying, hey, go through those H2 elements, and the first one that you find there, the first child that it has, put the cursor right there. What does that mean? That means that by default, when you start, okay, for lack of better words, when we run this, and you already saw it, but let's run it again. So when we open this up with live server, all right, there it is. All right. And I'm not touching the system to it. I think I do have to accept this. And there it is. All right. Now, that may have made very little sense. And even if it did, if it only made just a little bit of sense, like I said, that's okay. All right. I've given you some resources that you can take a look at some of this stuff. But After we get done with the break, which we're going to take in just a minute, as it says, we'll talk about how to script forms and controls. So it is 9 o'clock. Let's please come back at 9:10. We'll finish this one up and we'll jump right into the next chapter. So I'll see you at 9:10. And I'll be right back. All right, we're going to start back up, and I'm picking it up on page 196, how to script forms and controls. Now, please be cognizant of the fact that there's no way that Muroc could know that if you have this book, you've already gone through the other book and you know what forms are. So they explain what a form is, what a control is, etc., how forms work. All right. So they're really, most of the stuff that's in there, that's in here is not new. Two text boxes and a button. All right. And they show what you do is new. All right. But they do talk about get and they talk about post. Now, we're not talking getters and setters like we did before. We're talking about the method. All right. And what they are, no pun intended, but what they're getting to here is if you use a get when you submit a form, then all of the information that you are submitting in the form goes up here in the address line. So of course, you wouldn't want to do that if you had any kind of sensitive information. All right. And what's sensitive information? Well, to most of us, it's things like credit card numbers, passwords, and there's other things, of course, but those are probably two of the biggest. Now, some people will tell you that they use post almost all the time here because they don't want any of their information to be shown up there. The difference is when you submit it with a get rather, like I said, it goes up there. Not only that, if you've got something that's submitted with a post, all right, there's things that you can do with it that you cannot do with a get that you can't do with a post, such as you can bookmark things with a get. You can't bookmark. Now with typically whatever query string in here, it has a limit. I believe it used to be, at least it could have changed, but I believe the limit was about 4,000 characters. That might sound like a lot, but if you're got a really, really complex query string where you're ordering a lot of stuff, etc., that might not be big enough. All right. When you use a post, whatever you put in that query string is not shown there. Rather, it's, as they mentioned, it's packaged as part of your hypertext transfer protocol or HTTP request. Some books will say it's pretty much buried inside of the HTTP header. You can still typically dig it out, all right? But when you dig it out, one thing you want to make sure of is, for example, if you're sending a password or you're sending credit card information, that information is not being sent in what's called clear text. And what's clear text? That's this. It's text anybody can read. But if you send sensitive information and put it in non-clear text, it'll be converted. So if I had a password that was hello 123, it would be converted into about 40 different characters that would be uppercase, lowercase, letters, and numbers. All right. Okay, so it'd be encrypted, in other words. All right, so let's take a look at what else they have in here. And again, I mean, we've dealt with forms, with much more in them than this. But as you can see in here, where they have taken the stuff and put it in a mustard color, you'll notice that they've got an action. The action is literally what's going to happen once you go in and you click the equivalent of a submit button, which in this case would be called join our list. All right. And you're doing a get, which means the only thing that's going to be sent is the email address and the first name. All right. So that's how that stuff will be sent. And again, notice it says here, type equals submit. And you know that that's what's equated with the act. Now, we don't have a reset button, but if we had a reset button here, and we said instead of type equals submit, we said type equal reset, that would mean if you clicked it, that these two fields would go back to their default values, which probably in this case, probably at least, they'd be empty. All right. So there shouldn't be really anything that's new in here that I know of. We've talked about using the name property, and it says the name can be referred to by client side or server side, and that's true. And you might remember earlier I talked about name is typically done on server side. That's also true. ID is what you typically use on the client side, and name is what you typically use on the server side. And again, almost always, and there are exceptions, like when you use drop-down lists and the like, the name and the ID will be the same. All right. So they mention here data validation. All right. That's checking the data collected by the form to make sure it's valid. Now, you might look at that and say right here, well, we could come in and we don't even really need any JavaScript here. We could make these both required, which means you'd have to put something in for first name. And over here, we could not only make it required, we could make it type email. And that's true. All right. And that I'm telling you this is there, when you've got simplistic types of forms, you can typically just use HTML to do your validation. But as your forms get more complex and you introduce things like passwords, things like credit card numbers, etc., some of that more sensitive information that we talked about, you can do a certain amount still with just HTML by using pattern matching. You can do a certain amount. All right. But to be as complete as possible, what most developers do is they use a combination of both HTML and JavaScript to do their form validation. All right. Okay. Then they say how to script text boxes, text areas, and select objects. Guess what? You know much of this stuff already. Okay. And again, notice name and ID are the same. Name and ID are the same. Now here, they've got name and ID being the same. But when you start working in here, sometimes when you do this, you might give them different names. In fact, especially when you're working with things like radio buttons, if you want to make a radio button group, you make the name the same, but you make the ID of each button different. So if you wanted to be able to work with the radio buttons as a group, you'd be using the name property. And if you wanted to work with an individual radio button, you'd use the ID property. All right. And that's something to at least keep in mind here. Now you'll notice they've got the value attribute. And as it says, that value attribute will return a string. And that's whatever's been entered in this case into your input box or into your text area. And it'll also be whichever entry you chose in here. So you can go in and do some work with that, with the value. Now, notice in those cases, we're using the ID, all right, and we're using the pound sign in there. Sometimes the most confusing thing when you are working with JavaScript and you're starting to do programming with it, and you're programming not just the DOM, but you're programming form attributes and doing things with them, is to know when to use the pound sign and when not to. And I will tell you, how do I know? I put it in all the time. And if it doesn't work on something, I take it out. All right? Because the rules on it are kind of fuzzy, for lack of better word. So you'll notice here, this is something that we could end up putting. We've done things like this before, where we've had a like a clear form or something. So we've done this kind of stuff before. All right. Again, typically the name and IDs are going to be set to the same value. Like I said, the biggest exception to that is when you're working with radio buttons and you want to be able to use the radio buttons as a group. I already mentioned that. All right. After you use the value property, again, as they say, you can use the length property if you want to. Why would you want to do that? Well, think about it. All right. If you've ever signed up for anything and they ask you to make a password and you put in something simple and you click a submit button, it may not have worked, and it may come back and say something like the password must be a minimum of 8 characters, have at least one uppercase letter, one lowercase letter, and one number. All right, so they're doing some kind of regular expression pattern stuff on there to make sure you've got that, and they're using the length property to make sure that it is of minimum length. All right, setting the value property, as it says there, of a select, selects the option with a corresponding value. And again, with all this stuff, they're coming back as strings. All right. And again, here's basically what I just mentioned with the radio box, or radio buttons, and the check boxes. So you'll notice here with the radio button, they're the same name, but different IDs. I've already said this to you. Now, you'll notice again that when you're using these, it's checked whether it's a radio button or whether it's a checkbox. Radio buttons typically, not always. I mean, if you've got something, for instance, do you want to get our email? And you've got a radio button in there and it says yes. There's no group there. You could make a yes and a no, but most of the time you'll see it in there as just like a yes, or maybe even a checkbox. But normally, when you work with radio buttons, you'll have more than one, and you'll want to put them into a group. And remember, once you do that, that automatically your radio buttons then become mutually exclusive, meaning that you can only choose one of them. And if you've got two of them, one that says yes and one that says no, if you click on yes, then no is and yes is checked and no is unchecked, and vice versa. On the other hand, when you are working with checkboxes, they're not mutually exclusive. So you don't typically put them into a group. If for some reason they had to, then typically you should think about it and think maybe that would be maybe radio buttons would be better. All right, but again, you can use the checked property there in both cases. I'm not going to sit and read this to you because I think we've talked about it. All right. How to use the methods and events for forms and controls. I think I was going to say there's some tables here. Some of this we've talked about already. Some of this we haven't. When you click a submit button, all right, the submit method is going to run. Whatever you've set up to have it happen then. Normally, again, it's something that's set up with an action equal. Normally, what that means is when you submit something, all right, you want to send it off to a server. But what we're talking about here is you would want to validate all the form fields so you don't send it to the server unnecessarily, so that the server would want to send it right back to you. That wouldn't make a boatload of sense. All right. Reset, as it says. The key thing there is everybody says, well, when you have reset, it just removes everything. That's not true. Reset resets things to their default values, whatever you set it to by default. So for instance, if you had a drop-down list for state, and the first thing that was in there was please select the state, and you clicked reset, it would go back to the first thing that's in there, please select the state. All right. 3 methods that are used with controls. I'm hoping at least that people understand what focus is by now. All right. It moves the focus. In other words, that's the field that will have the cursor blinking on it. Now, blur can be confusing to people, and I may have explained it already, I may not have, but I'm going to again anyway. All right. Let's suppose that I've got a real simple form. It's got 3 fields on it: first name, last name, and email. I set the focus so that when the program starts to run, it's on first name, because that's my first field. All right. Once I'm on the first, I put in a first name, and let's say that I just click the mouse on the last name field. 2 things happen. Number 1, a blur event happens that's associated with the first name because I'm removing the focus. And a focus event happens, which means I now have the focus on another field. The same kind of thing happens when I go from last name to email. Now, why is this important? Well, let's suppose that, you really want to make sure that when people go in and they validate a form, that everything is exactly the way that you want it to be. All right. So as an example, let's suppose let's suppose that you got a name field, and that name field is set up that you can have any letter in it, upper or lowercase. So it's a first name field, nothing else. I'm being very restrictive here on purpose. So we've got a first name field, and the only thing we're allowing in there are uppercase A to Z or lowercase A to Z. Nothing else. No spaces, no hyphens, no nothing. All right. So somebody puts in their name and maybe hits the space afterwards. I don't know. And then they go to another field again, which makes a blur event on the first name and a focus on the new field. You can check in the blur event, and if they didn't meet all of your criteria, you can send the focus back to the original field. You can do that. Not only that, if you use the select, that would highlight the field typically in blue. So hopefully they could see what they did wrong. And if you use the span tag and off to the right, and this is what we're going to be doing as we go on, you can let them know you put in a non-alphabetic character or something like that. All right. So again, I've mentioned focus, I've mentioned blur, I've mentioned, about the click event already. Hopefully, if you know click, you understand double click. All right. Change, as it says, when the value of a control changes. These are all things you could conceivably add code in, any of these control events. And then there's select, which we already mentioned. So there are here, and I don't know if it'll help to look at those for you or hurt. Notice they're using arrow functions with all these. All right. And then they're setting up event listeners with, again, the DOM.add event listener to the DOM content loaded. Now, hopefully you're getting a better understanding of that DOM content loaded, what that means. All right. Okay, so the next one here is this register application. Before we even go through it, let me bring it up and run it. So I'm going to close this one, the FAQs that we had here, and I thought it was here, but I don't know if it is. That's interesting. Well, then I guess we'll have to bring it up here. I did book things. It's not the image swap. It's not that, and it's not a slideshow. Oh, this is chapter 7. That's why. Okay, let me bring up chapter 6. My error. I did 7 and 8 instead of 6 and 7. That's my fault. Let me go grab that. And again, this is from the student download book apps. I should have grabbed 6, but I grabbed 7. All right. So there's 6. Let me close this. All right, and let me reopen this with code, but I'm opening the right one now, the chapter 6. I was wondering why that looks so funky. Very quickly, if we go back and look at the FAQs one that we looked at before, notice how it's going to be different when I run it now. Okay, so when I open live server and I go to one of these, all right, you might say it's no different. Yes, it is. First of all, it didn't have that agreement and all that other stuff showing that was there before. All right. And it's not automatically, just like the other one, it's not automatically closing these when you open up another one. All right. Let's look at the form one that's in here though, and then we'll go back and kind of break it down. So on that FAQs, first one is register, and here's the index. Again, here's the form. There shouldn't be anything new in there other than notice we've got this span field here. and it's here. So each one of these fields that we put in here that's required has got this span field in. And you'll notice if I run this, we've got the asterisks here. And if I click register, you can see how they change. All right. Also, probably at least, I don't know if they made this an email field or not. All right, they're not. So, I mean, I think they're going to fix it a little bit later, but you'll notice as soon as I put something in there, okay? Also notice they defaulted this. So one of these was always chosen, all right? And once I click in there, now as soon as I click register, it's going to go to another HTML page. Thank you for registering. That's not typically the way you would handle that. But the point here is you'll notice that every field that's a required field has a red asterisk by it. And if we do this, all of those, what happens is that red asterisk changes to an error message. This is the generic, this field is required, and here, please select a country, and here, this box must be checked. There's not really anything new in there other than those spans that I just mentioned to you. All right. But I guess if we do come in there and we open up the associated JavaScript, all right, what do we have in here? Well, again, here's our variables. So what are we doing right here? We're doing those getters. We're getting the value from those 4 fields. 2 of those fields, the first 2, are text boxes. All right. The next field that you see in there is the value of a drop-down list. And the last one is the value of a checkbox. So we can refer to them programmatically now as email, phone, country, and terms. Okay, then we're validating. So we're assuming everything is valid. If we find out there's nothing in the email, boom, we set is valid to false. Now, going back to our index here, all right, notice, I think they wrote it like this on purpose. They made this type, they made this type text. If they'd have made it type email, that would have provided some HTML form validation. They didn't. If they had made this type tell, I think it would have done some too. But they didn't do it like that for whatever reason. All right. So we're coming in here, we're checking, is email empty? If it is valid will be false. And this is what's new. Email.nextElementSibling.text content. What is that? That's the asterisk. So email is the name of the field. The next element that's connected or that's right after it in the same group is the asterisk. The current text context in there, all right, is an asterisk, but we're telling it here. So if we went back to here and we change this, I'll just change one of them, but I'm going to go back, let's go back to first name here, and I'll put this in here as required. Like that. And I save it and we run this again. You'll notice how that now says required. But still, if I click that, it changes. All right. So that is the value that they're talking about right there. In our JavaScript, when they mention next element sibling, and then the text content, the else means we put in something. So we're making sure it changes from an asterisk to nothing. So when we get down to here, is valid is true if we put in something there, and it's false if we did not. If we put something in there, to the right of the email text box, there's nothing. If we didn't put anything in there, we're going to get the message that says this field is required. Then we do the same thing with phone value. Now, all we're checking for here is the presence or absence of something. For instance, there's no pattern match in here that checks for a phone number. That's why when I put hello in there, it took it just fine. Country's a little bit different. All right. Because right now, country has in it, select the country. And notice there's no value for it. That's important. All right. This has got a value of 0 and 1 and 2, I believe. Could be 1, 2, and 3, but I think it's 0, 1, and 2. All right. And we will work some more with this stuff next semester and work with them in C# as well. All right. So again, we're either going to get a message that says, please select a country, if it still says select a country, or it'll be empty. And then we do a similar thing. If you have checked that checkbox that says this, if you haven't checked it, you get the error message, this box must be checked. Otherwise, it's set to nothing. And then only if is valid is still true after all that stuff, only then do we come in and actually call the submit action for the form. All right. And what do we have in here? All right. Type equal button register. So that is saying that if that works, we want to call this right here. And we're using a get. So again, last time here, if I run this, and I'll put in here, JP Scott at Rankin. All right, mobile phone. Typically, I'd put it in like this, but it doesn't care. USA, contact me by, I'll leave it like that. And now watch up here. All right. And there's all that information up in the query string. It's got the name of the field, followed by an equal sign, followed by the value. And for the @ sign, for example, that's this %40 that you see right there. Okay. And a reset form should be pretty obvious. Okay. Those 4 fields, it's setting the asterisk back, and it's setting the focus. Calls reset first, and what reset is going to do in this case is it's going to, for our drop-down list, it'll set it back to select a country. And then we've got our event listeners. Again, when we click the register button, call this. When we click the reset button, call this. And again, just like here, make sure when the program starts, the email address, which is the first field in our list, is the one that's highlighted. Right? All right. Now, they also use a span of red in there. They could have even bolded it, but this is pretty much what I just showed you. So we looked at the HTML already, and we looked at the JavaScript already. All right. Now, what they do after this, first, they're going to have this section in here on how to modify the DOM, but there's going to be a version 2 at the end of the chapter. We've only got about 7 or 8 pages left in the chapter, but right at the end, they're going to go back and add even more validation and have a version 2 of this registration form. So this is how to use the DOM in these next 5 or 6 pages. This is how to use it to manipulate the nodes that are in a document, to add nodes, to remove nodes, and to update nodes that are in there. And that's what they talk about in here. So you'll notice if I want to create a new node, what does that mean with a create element? I can go in and I new hyperlink or a brand new H1 tag or a brand new whatever. All right. Not only that, when I create it, I can tell it where I want it to go. And that's some of those methods that they mentioned there. I can insert it before something that exists. I can append it to the end. I can replace something that did exist with this. All right. Plus, as it says there, I can remove something. So if you look at the example here, they've got first paragraph and last paragraph. And when you click add to DOM, they've added a new middle paragraph. And the whole idea there is when you're going to do that, you're telling it to append the child, but you're telling it where you want it to be appended to. All right, so we're telling it to insert it before, all right, and where we want it to go. Well, in this case, it's first paragraph, dot next sibling, which would have been the last paragraph. And again, there are other ways that this can be done. Just want to make sure you know that. They'll typically they show you a bunch of stuff in here and they go, this is how you do it, and they're right. But what they should really be saying is this is one way you can do it. And I've already mentioned this last time. I will take a look at this if you get some time. All right. All right. So the last thing that's in the chapter here then is this updated, upgraded, whatever you want to call it, version 2 of this register application. So again, notice what you've done here. In some languages, what they do is they call what you see right here a validation summary. In other words, they've taken all of the error messages and instead of putting them right here and here, they put them on the top. All right. You'll do some work with that, those of you, or when you get to your last class here, your AWD1115, the database-driven website development 2 class. All right, we do a lot of work with validation summaries like this. So the CSS for this, again, they're putting it into a box, for lack of better words. The updated JavaScript, well, what they're doing now is they're looping through, all right, and they are adding to that box, they are appending the child, and they're putting it in as a list item, all right? So in other words, they'll have the dot in front of them. Okay? So, and then finally it checks and it says, if there is no UL, add it before starting to put in the LIs. Okay. And I'm not even going to go over the rest of the stuff that's in here. You can run it if you have an interest. Now, notice what they mention in here in the perspective. The goal of this chapter has been to introduce you to some of the capabilities of DOM scripting. In other words, by just going through this chapter, by no means are you an expert on the DOM. I would even argue that there are very few, if any, people who are experts on the DOM. People are constantly tweaking things you do with the document object model. All right. Especially once you get some experience with it, because the idea is you want to make things run as fast as possible. And anything you do, you want to make it as intuitive as possible so people understand it. Finally, on that last paragraph that you see here on the page, it says, before you continue, you should know that there's a limit on what you can do with the DOM. All right. It says that's because jQuery is a JavaScript library designed to make the DOM even easier. And that's one of the reasons I'm going to go into it I'm going to go through the next section. All right, so that is it for chapter 6. So I'm going to jump right into chapter 7, which is a shorter chapter. And they mention here, you can see it's images and timers. And as it says on the top here, in the last chapter, we learned DOM scripting. This chapter presents additional skills, but it's working with images and it's working with timers. All right. And they're saying that Some of the stuff that you do in here, it's darn near impossible to do it with something like jQuery. All right. And much of this stuff, like image swaps and timers, it's already in there in the system, and people have done it in pure JavaScript. Now, notice what we're going to talk about in here: images, image swaps, timers, and then there'll be a slideshow application. All right. One of the things that they're not really going into in here are things like carousels. All right. That's one of the reasons in that simple example, and we're going to look at it when we get done with this chapter, that I gave you. All right. It's got a carousel on it. We'll go through that as well. But again, it is possible to work with images and do virtually, maybe not everything, but most of the stuff they'll talk about in the next few pages without using what's called vanilla JavaScript. In other words, just JavaScript. Same thing with image swap, same thing with timers, same thing with slideshows. There are articles that I've seen that how to build a slider using Bootstrap, how to build a slider using just HTML and CSS, how to build a slider using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So again, that would be 3 different ways of building the same thing. All right. So it says many web apps manipulate images that they display in a browser. What does that mean, manipulate them? You might want to change their size. You might want to change their position. All right, where they're laid out on a page. There's all sorts of things that you could do. And they mention here that the figure that we'll look at in just a moment on the next page lists some of the attributes of the HTML image element. Some of these you already know about. All right. You know about things like source, and you know about things like height and width, etc. Now, they do mention here, in most cases, you'll use imaging software to create images that are the right size for your web pages. Well, that imaging software, by and large, is not going to be free. And since in this program, one of the things we pride ourselves is we're not charging you for any software, all right, and I would never want to do that anyway, all right? So you can also do it programmatically, all right? As they mentioned there, to work with an image element, you use the HTML element image object. To create an instance of this object, you use the image constructor and new keyword that we'll look at in just a moment. All right. Now, next they talk about preloading, and I want to take what they're saying in here, and you can see all of it. And I don't want to read a bit of it, but I want to kind of put it into my own verbiage. If you have a lot of images that you're going to have on a page, and especially if the images are very intricate, they could be very large, they could have a lot of different stuff in them, or you could even have the idea that who's ever going to use this might have a slow connection. It may then take a couple minutes before those images load. So the page starts coming up, and you might see kind of a ghost type of image where you know something's going to come up. Well, considering the fact that many people are not apt to stick around, it's, oh, there must be a problem, and they just get out. One way you can do this is you can preload the images. As it says, you load them then before before the page comes up. As it says, then the browser can display the images without delay. So it might take a second or two before the page starts to load, but during that second or two, it's actually bringing in all of the images it needs. And that's pretty much at least what they're talking about in here. So source, alt, width, height. But what are they doing right here? All right. That's creating a brand new image. Now, that image doesn't have any source attached to it. doesn't have any alt text, has no height. But what we're doing here is we're saying new, which means instantiate or create a new object of the image class and call it image. All right. Then they come in and preload it or show you how you can preload it, doing it the same thing, but then immediately setting the source. All right. And if you're going to have a lot of these, notice here, they're doing the same thing, but they're putting it in a loop. And that's pretty much what they talk about in here. Again, I don't want to sit and read to you. All right. So the next example that's in there, and I'm going to bring up the chapter 7 stuff in just a moment, is an image swap application. You probably have seen something like this in the past. Let's bring it up. And before we even look at the code, but let's bring it up and take a look at what's in here. So this is chapter 7. I've got the right chapter now. And we're going to bring up image swap. All right. And let's start by bringing up the index.html page and let's run it. So you'll notice the one that's highlighted is the one that's showing if I click here. So it's pretty obvious, or at least hopefully it is pretty obvious what's happening. All right. That as we click one of the thumbnails, what's changing in here, all right, is it's taking that thumbnail image and it's putting it in here. So if we take a look at what makes this go, so to speak, all right, you'll notice that what we've done here is we've loaded virtually everything in here. All right, but we can always go in, remember, with CSS and have the display set to none. All right, and then programmatically go in and figure out which one it is. So we've got the use strict, we've got our alias. All right, we're finding the caption, we're finding the main image. Then as it says, we're getting all the A tags, all right, which has got our image links in there. So we're coming in here in this for loop that starts on line 14, and we're preloading everything. Okay. But then what we want to do is we want to come in here basically and figure out which one is it that we want. This is just setting it up at the beginning so that the first one shows by default. We didn't want that. I think there's 4 of them. If we set this to 3, and then went back and ran the program again, all right, you'll notice, well, I thought it was going to change it. Must be someplace else in here as well. All right, but you could do that if you didn't want it to start on the first one. Now, what you also could do, you'd have to do this programmatically, but you could, for example, using timers that we'll talk about just in just a little bit, as opposed to clicking on here. Okay, we could set a timer so it starts here. It waited maybe 5 seconds, and then it chose that one. It waited 5 more seconds, and it chose that one. 5 more seconds, and it chose that one. Then it spun back around to the beginning again. All right, that's the way a lot of slideshows work. All right. Now, but most of them like that just have a bigger picture. And I'm going to show you my example in just a bit, but they don't typically have thumbnails like this. All right. So again, if we do look in here, like I said, here we're setting it. It says sets the focus on the first link, and someplace else in there, they must be setting it as well. Right. Or I didn't save it. I don't know. That could be too. I may just not have saved it. Let's see if we do that, if it changes it. Let's make it 2. Now, if it doesn't change it, that just means it's being set someplace else in here. That's all. Yep. It's not setting it 0, 1, 2. Notice which one's highlighted, but notice which one's showing. All right. So that means that someplace else in here it's being set. It could even be in the HTML. I don't know. All right. So I've kind of ran through this. I don't want to go through the HTML. All right, or the CSS for that matter. But the JavaScript is what we just mentioned. Okay. And the best way to learn this is to just open this thing up yourselves. All right. And play with it. Just move some stuff around. I tried something and it didn't work. See if you can take what I couldn't make work. See if you can make it work. All right. Now, there's only about 8 or 9 pages left in the chapter. So the next thing that you're going to talk about in here are timers. And what you have to realize with timers is I kind of equate a timer, all right, to an alarm clock. All right. If you remember the old-fashioned alarm clocks, you may or may not have seen one, you may or may not have one, but you used to wind them up, all right, and you'd set the alarm. You maybe would pull out a little prong or whatever, and if you had it set for 6, at 6, boom, it would start going off, and it would keep going off until it either ran out or you hit a button to turn it off. But it was a one-time shot, all right? So if I turned it off and I went back to sleep, I was kind of hosed. On the other hand, like for example, the alarm clock that I use every morning, and I've gotten to the point where I never hit snooze, but it has a snooze on it. And with that snooze, it'll wait 10 minutes and then it'll go off again. Why am I telling you this? Because the old-fashioned alarm clock is like a set timeout. It's a one-time timer. The set interval, which you'll see in just a couple minutes, that's like if you keep hitting the snooze button. It'll go off, then 10 minutes later, it'll go off again, then 10 minutes later, it'll go off again, etc. So, as they mention here, a timer lets you execute a function after a specified period of time. Now, back in the olden days, like in the 90s, no joke, but what used to happen is before Microsoft really got into and had their Office suite, all right, what most people used was something that was called Word. All right, not Microsoft Word. In fact, it was called Word Perfect. And with older versions of Word Perfect, because I know I taught that that was many, many moons ago, like maybe it was 30 years ago or more. All right. And when I taught Word Perfect, what you'd see is about every 5 or 10 minutes, what would happen is if you hadn't saved, you'd get a message because it would auto save like every 10 minutes or so. And it was letting you know that it had saved for you. That was an interval timer. All right. You could turn that off and just tell it not to save anything until you did a save. That would be a one-time timer. All right, so it says timers are provided by web browsers rather than the DOM or by ECMA, European Computer Manufacturing Association, script standards. They're often useful in DOM scripting applications like slideshows. Okay, so as it says here, we'll learn about 2 types. I already mentioned the one to you. All right, a one-time timer. That's a set timeout. Okay. I believe that the way this was set up, if you remember, because I accidentally brought that one up earlier, but after 5 seconds, if you didn't click the button, it went away anyway. All right. So the set timeout, again, it's like that alarm clock, the old-fashioned alarm clock. All right. And you set it for a time, it goes off. Well, if I've got my alarm clock set for 7 a.m. and I wake up and it's 5 to 7 and I'm like, I don't want to try to go back to sleep for 5 minutes, I can turn the alarm clock off. That's a clear timeout. So the set timeout says wait delay is how many seconds do you want to wait? Function is what you want to do once that delay happens. So if you want to wait 10 minutes and then you want to call a function, for example. All right. And now they say milliseconds, and that's true. There's 1,000 milliseconds in 1 second. So if I want to wait 10 minutes or 10 seconds rather before I do something, it's 10,000 milliseconds. All right. All right. Clearing the timer, I've already mentioned to you. Okay. So what they've done on here, that's at terms of service. Like I said, there's a timer in here that waits. It's in, there it is. It says wait 5 seconds and then go to terms. What is the go to terms? That says basically unload what was in there, which is this thing, and load in instead this. That is in terms of service right there. All right. It's just letting you know that they changed and so again, you probably saw this one before, but just in case, if we bring this one here up, let's close the image swap and we'll bring up, I guess it was the FAQs, and we run that. So again, in here, should be in here someplace. Let's see. Oh, I thought it was in this one. Maybe it's not, but let's look anyway. One, two, three, 4, 5. There it goes. Now this one doesn't have anything. So this one is set up so that you have to click that to get back over to here. All right. So anything that you've got that involves timing, is what they're saying is you can use this. All right. Now, and you might look at that and go, I still don't understand. Why would you ever want to use this? Maybe as an example, I mean, this could be used all over the place. You could have a real simplistic game that you created where you ask somebody some questions and they had 10 seconds to answer the question, or it was automatically wrong. So you could set a timer for 10 seconds. And if they hadn't answered during that time, all right, then you could just give them say, mark it as wrong or whatever. And if they did answer within that time and they clicked a button or whatever, you'd cancel that timer. So as it says, the set timeout method returns a reference to the time creates. All right. What you're going to see next week when I go back and rewrite some of this stuff that we've done earlier, the BMI, etc., is what we'll do is we'll put in an error message. So you put in a weight and you put in a negative weight. All right. We'll use we'll use that next element sibling and we'll change an asterisk to an error message like weight must be between 1 and 777 pounds. Then we'll wait 5 seconds. We'll make that error message go away. If they put in 1,000, we'll have whatever they put in for the weight disappear and we'll set the focus to that field. That's the way that this stuff is used. All right, again, an interval timer says you want it to go off. So this is very popular, again, with things like slideshows. And the same thing I mentioned to you earlier, where you might want to wait X number of seconds, whatever X happens to be. All right, 5 seconds. You probably have heard this. I may have said it before, I may not have. But typically, if I'm making a slideshow and it's on a website that I know is going to be frequented more by young people, I'll probably set it to about 2 or 3 seconds because little kids are more impatient. If I'm setting a site and I've got that in there, especially if it's a site more for older people, especially if there's a lot of text on the slides, I might set it to 10 seconds. So they've got time to really look at it. But again, sometimes too, you put the little buttons in there. So if it's not moving fast enough, you can make it, they can move it themselves. So as it says here, the set interval returns a reference to the timer it creates, all right, and it'll keep going off, all right. Now notice it says there, you can't modify it, but you can cancel it and create a new one. All right, so if you're waiting 5 seconds and you're like, geez, that's too much time. All right, typically what you'll do is you'll drop a timer and clear, set up a new timer, and clear will do it. So basically, all right, that'll stop the timer from going. So the last thing they have in here in this chapter is a slideshow. So if I close this one, so that's slideshow. Again, if we come in here and run it, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, etc. So it's just cycling through the same ones that you saw before. All right, so someplace in here, and I'll stop the run, someplace in here, it's telling it to cycle through, and it's giving it an amount of time to use to cycle through. All right, here they're counting it, and notice here it's 2 seconds. All right, which is pretty short. So I'm going to change this to 8. All right, and I'm going to run this again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, to some people, that would be way, way too slow. And if it was pictures, you probably wouldn't want it set to 8. But again, there's nothing saying that you can't have text with the pictures or just text in a slideshow. Then you might want to change it so it would be, a different amount, something more like I'm showing you right here. All right. And that is pretty much it for the chapter. All right. Again, they give you some JavaScript in here with an explanation. Okay. And it says, now you should understand how to use JavaScript to work with images and timers, ideally. Now, again, that does finish this part of the book. So when we come back next week, at the end of next week, we'll be going through section 2 on jQuery Essentials. The last thing I want to do today, and I'm hoping we can do this in 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever, is what I sent you this morning. All right. And under this DOM folder, I sent you something I'd created. There used to be a campaign. I don't know if it was still out there. It was, you can call me Mo, or that's what this stands for, YCC me MM. And when we look at this, now I don't remember if there's a timer set up with this or not. Doesn't look like it, but we can either move these slides clicking here, or we can click here. All right, is that big a thing? Not at all. All right, but what I want to show you here, and we'll look at it in a moment, is, and this about very similar to stuff I've shown you before. If I click here, it goes, I think, to the Wikipedia page on the seal of Missouri. And notice, stupidly, I didn't put that in a target equal blank. This one is in a target equal blank. All right. And these are all hyperlinkable. In other words, I can go to the Cardinal page, etc. All right. This MPG easy. All right. This is about as simple as it gets. These was all with alerts. Okay. This other one is called MPG hard. This is the kind of stuff we're going to look at next week. So notice in here, if I can't put anything non-numeric. These are both set up as number fields. Trying to put in letters, it won't take it. Letters, it won't take it. But if I leave it blank and I click calculate, I get an error message. I'm not checking everything. I'm only checking this. So as soon as I put a number in there, Now I get it in the other one. All right. Now it worked. I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look at this. I found this morning, so I just pulled it out there. All right. The help is nothing. It's just another alert. Tells you how to use it. And the reset, okay, it tells you the current size of your screen. I was going to start doing some work to make this responsive. I just didn't have enough time. But it clears everything out, puts the asterisks back. All right. And it puts the cursor right there. So if you take a quick look at this, and I mean a quick look, I'm going to do a view page source here. All right. And when I look, this is JS MPG hard right there. So this is it. Okay. So you've got this code. Now I wrote this using function expressions, and I was going to convert it to arrow functions this morning. Again, I didn't have time. It wouldn't take much time to do that. I just didn't. All right. But when you look in here, notice, okay. Now, I may not have done it exactly the way they've done it in the book, because again, there's more than one way of doing the same thing. All right. But you've got this, and this may not, I don't know, but this may help you next week when you take your test. All right. So the whole idea behind this is basically, in this particular example, the one right here, was to show you a little bit of DOM work. Also, if we come back and I go over to here, I made it real big, but I'll make it smaller. All right. If I go to the home page and I right mouse click and I choose view page source, and again, I go and find my slideshow. I took this right from W3 Schools. This is when I did do this one earlier. I didn't make those. I made those arrow functions. All right. Didn't have time to do the other ones. The only thing that happened was that I had to change was I had to take my call down here to show slides. It used to be up here, right there. But the system, once I made them arrow functions, didn't like it. So I had to call it down at the bottom. Again, just to show you, and it's no big thing. All right, but I'm going to do it right in front of you. So if I screw it up, I screw it up. But I'm going to come in here where it says MPG hard. All right. And I'm going to go back to all these. Well, look, there's their $sign for get element by ID. Nothing new there. All right. Again, I could make that an arrow function, but I'm going to see if I can make all these arrow functions now. In fact, I don't want to say that anymore. I'm going to say let now, let. Or I could even say const. I think it'll work fine with const. So let me change all of them to const. See if we can get it to work. Now it's possible this won't work. And here I'm using onload, which is another way of doing an event handler. All right. See if we can even do that one. I don't know if that'll work or not, but we'll try that. So everything will then be with arrow functions. Let's run it again and see if it works. It may not, but I'm not worried about it one way or the other. Go back to the home page, back to MPG hard. Doesn't like it, so let's see. Syntax error. Line 63. Doesn't like something there, and I don't know what it is. Oh, there's an equal sign here. I don't know what that's doing there. See if that's what it was. Refresh the page. Nope, that wasn't it. Missing identifier in const declaration, line 69. Missed one. Well, 126, I'm working my way down. Missing initializer in const declaration, line 126. Still says missing initializer. I don't think it likes me doing this way, to be honest with you. Let's see if I back that up. Don't want that equal sign in there. Well, it's gonna take a while to figure it out. All right. But that's what I had. So again, on Monday of next week, as I already showed you, we're going to go over the short exercises for chapter 6 and 7 and the extra exercises for 6 and 7. If I have time between now and then, I'm going to rewrite the the guessing game program and the BMI program to include DOM manipulation and include timers. All right. But like I said, that's all I have for today. Have a good rest of the day. Have a good weekend, and I will talk to you on Monday.